Cops handcuffed and punched a woman, then panicked when they learned she was the new federal prosecut. The evening sun was slowly setting over the busy city streets. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and people hurried home after a long day. Among the moving cars, a black sedan drove steadily, following the traffic rules and blending with the flow. Inside the car sat a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a simple dark suit, her hair neatly tied back. She looked calm, though her eyes showed a quiet determination, the kind of look carried by someone who knew her purpose and her place in the world. She was not an ordinary woman. She was someone with a history of discipline, achievement, and silent strength. But to anyone watching her from outside the car, she was just another driver making her way home. She held the wheel firmly and hummed softly to herself, her mind occupied by thoughts of the work ahead. She was new in town, and though she carried an important title, she preferred to keep a low profile until the time was right. A few blocks away, a police car was parked on the corner of the street. Inside, 2 officers watched the cars passing by. One of them, a younger officer, seemed restless, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. The older officer, more confident, leaned back and scanned the road with sharp eyes. When the black sedan passed them, the older officer narrowed his gaze. "That one looks suspicious," he muttered. The younger officer leaned forward. "Why? She's just driving." The older officer shrugged. "Call it instinct. Let's check her out." The flashing red and blue lights came on, and the police car pulled out, signaling for the black sedan to stop. The woman glanced at her rearview mirror, a small frown appearing on her face. She slowed down and pulled to the side of the road. She rolled down her window and waited calmly as the officers approached. "License and registration," the older officer demanded without a greeting. His tone was sharp, almost accusing. The woman handed over her documents without hesitation. She looked him directly in the eyes and asked softly, "Is there a problem, officer?" Instead of answering, the younger officer began circling her car, peering through the windows as though expecting to find something illegal. "What's in the trunk?" he asked suddenly. The woman replied, "Personal belongings. Nothing illegal." But her calm voice seemed to irritate him further. The older officer flipped through her documents, then snapped, "Step out of the car." The woman hesitated for a moment, then unbuckled her seat belt and stepped onto the sidewalk. A few passers-by slowed down, curious about the scene. The officers stood close, their presence heavy and unkind. "What's your business here?" the younger officer asked. "I live here now," she replied evenly. "I just moved." The older officer smirked. "Moved here? Where from?" She gave the name of another city. He raised an eyebrow. "And what do you do for work?" The woman paused for a moment. She could have told them the truth right then, but she wanted to see how far they would take their behavior. So instead of answering directly, she said, "I work in law." The officers exchanged glances, but instead of respecting her, they laughed. "Law, huh? You look a little too nervous for someone in law." By now, a small crowd had started to gather a few feet away. A couple of young men took out their phones and began recording the incident. The woman noticed, but she remained calm. The older officer stepped closer, his voice low but threatening. "Listen, lady, if you don't start cooperating, we're going to have a problem." "I am cooperating," she replied steadily. "I've done nothing wrong. You stopped me without reason. Please explain why." Her words only seemed to fuel his temper. He suddenly grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. "Don't talk back," he growled. The crowd gasped. The younger officer quickly took out handcuffs and snapped them onto her wrists. She winced slightly but did not cry out. Her eyes stayed firm, and her voice remained calm. "You are making a serious mistake." The crowd grew larger, whispering among themselves. "Why are they treating her like that?" one woman asked. She doesn't look like a criminal. Another man added, this doesn't feel right. They didn't even explain why they stopped her. One teenager in the crowd squinted at the woman's face. He had seen her photo before, on a local news article announcing new federal appointments. His heart skipped a beat. He opened his phone quickly and scrolled through the news feed, trying to confirm his suspicion. Meanwhile, the officers pushed the woman roughly against the patrol car. You think you're smarter than us, the younger officer mocked. You think your calm act is going to save you. The woman looked over her shoulder and said clearly, everything you're doing is being recorded. Not just by the crowd but by the truth that will come out very soon. Her words unsettled them for a brief second, but they quickly covered it up with arrogance. The older officer muttered, let's take her in. We'll sort this out at the station. The teenager finally found the article he was looking for. His eyes widened as he matched the face on his screen with the face of the woman against the patrol car. He whispered loudly, that's her. She's the new federal prosecutor. I saw it on the news. A ripple went through the crowd. People started murmuring louder. Phones tilted higher, recording every detail. The officers stiffened slightly, sensing the shift in the air, but they refused to let go. The woman straightened her posture as much as she could in her restrained position. Her voice was calm but carried power. I told you. You are making a mistake. And it will cost you. The crowd buzzed with energy. Some people gasped, others shook their heads. A middle-aged man muttered, if she really is who they say, those cops are finished. The tension grew heavier. The officers suddenly felt the weight of dozens of eyes and cameras on them. Their confidence started to crack, though they tried to maintain control. But the woman, though handcuffed, stood taller than them in spirit. She knew exactly who she was and exactly what power she carried. The evening that had started as ordinary had now turned into something unforgettable. And though the officers didn't yet realize the full gravity of their actions, the crowd knew change was about to come. The cold metal of the handcuffs pressed against her wrists, but the woman's face stayed calm. The two officers tightened their grip on her arms as though they were trying to remind her who had the power in that moment. The older officer whispered harshly, stop acting smart. You're not in control here. She did not answer, and that silence felt heavier than words. Her quiet composure seemed to unsettle them more than shouting ever could. Around them, the small crowd continued to grow. People whispered, pointing at the officers and the woman. Some had already started live streaming the scene, their voices low but filled with disbelief. Why are they handling her like that? One person muttered. Another added, she doesn't even look scared. It's almost like she knows something they don't. The younger officer noticed the cameras and frowned. Put those phones away, he barked at the crowd. But no one listened. Instead, more phones went up, red lights blinking as they recorded every move. The woman turned her head slightly toward the crowd and gave the faintest smile, almost as if to reassure them that she was not broken, that she was in control in a way the officers could not understand. The teenager who had recognized her earlier grew more restless. He wanted to shout out the truth, to tell everyone exactly who she was. But he hesitated, unsure if anyone would believe him. Instead, he stepped forward, holding up his phone, trying to capture her face more clearly. His heart was racing because he knew if this went on any longer, the entire city was about to learn the truth. The older officer suddenly shoved the woman forward, forcing her against the side of the patrol car. She stumbled but caught herself, straightening up again. You are overstepping, she said in a low voice, her words deliberate. This will not end the way you think it will. The younger officer laughed mockingly. Oh yeah? And what's going to happen? You'll tell your lawyer? Please. Nobody cares. People like you are all the same, talking big, but powerless once the law has you. Her calm eyes fixed on his. I am not powerless. And the law is not yours to twist. The crowd gasped at her courage. Some began murmuring louder now, their voices filled with both admiration and anger. One man shouted, "She's right. You don't even have a reason to hold her." The officers turned sharply toward the man, but the crowd's energy had already shifted. People no longer looked at the woman as a helpless victim. They began to sense she was someone important. The teenager finally gathered the courage to speak. His voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger. "She's the new federal prosecutor," he yelled. "I saw her on the news last week. That's her." A wave of shock went through the crowd. Dozens of eyes widened, and people leaned closer, whispering rapidly. "The federal prosecutor. Wait, really? If that's true, these cops are finished." Phones zoomed in on her face, matching it with the image spreading quickly online. The older officer froze for a second, his eyes darting toward her as if seeing her for the first time. But his pride would not let him back down. "Don't listen to him," he barked at the crowd. "She's no prosecutor. She's lying, and you're all being fooled." But the woman finally spoke with a steady voice that carried over the noise of the street. "I told you before. You are making a mistake. I am the new federal prosecutor assigned to this district. And every second you continue this behavior, you are writing the end of your own careers." Gasps filled the air. Some people clapped, others began shouting at the officers. The younger one looked pale, his earlier confidence fading as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond control. He leaned toward his partner and whispered, "What if she's telling the truth?" The older officer clenched his jaw. "Don't lose your nerve. She's bluffing." But deep down, doubt had begun to creep into his mind. He noticed the way the crowd was recording, the way people were already typing furiously on their phones, sharing videos, tagging local news. He could almost see his own name flashing across headlines if what she said turned out to be true. The woman straightened her back, her handcuffed wrists still behind her, but her presence commanding the space around her. She no longer looked like someone under arrest. She looked like someone in charge of the whole scene, even in chains. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their power slipping away 1 second at a time. A police supervisor finally arrived, drawn by the growing noise and the sight of the crowd. His car pulled up, and he stepped out, frowning at the chaos. He pushed through the crowd and demanded, "What's going on here?" The crowd erupted all at once. "They arrested the federal prosecutor. She didn't do anything wrong. Check who she is." The supervisor turned sharply toward the officers, his face tightening. "Is that true?" The older officer stammered, She was acting suspicious. We were just doing our job." The supervisor looked directly at the woman, and for the first time, the air shifted completely. His eyes widened in recognition. He had seen her face on the official announcement from Washington just days earlier. His stomach dropped as realization struck him. The woman met his eyes calmly and said, "Yes. I am who they say I am. And I have endured enough of this nonsense. Take these off." She lifted her wrists slightly, the steel cuffs glinting under the streetlights. The supervisor's hand trembled as he reached for the keys. He unlocked the cuffs slowly, his mind racing with panic. The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts, their cameras capturing every second. The two arresting officers stood frozen, their faces drained of color. The woman rubbed her wrists lightly, then turned to face the two men who had treated her with such arrogance. Her voice was calm but firm. "You thought you were untouchable. You thought the law was in your hands to abuse. But the law does not belong to you. It belongs to the people. And people like me are here to make sure it is respected." The younger officer swallowed hard, his earlier bravado gone. The older officer's lips moved as if to speak, but no words came out. The crowd recorded their every expression, their fear, their shame, their sudden realization of the storm they had brought upon themselves. The woman stepped back toward her car, her presence commanding silence for a moment. Then she turned to the crowd and gave a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you for standing here. Thank you for watching. The truth matters." The crowd erupted again, cheering her, chanting her title, some even shouting her name as it spread rapidly online. What had started as a simple traffic stop had now turned into a public reckoning, and the night was far from over. The street, once filled with casual evening traffic, had now transformed into the center of attention. The flashing lights of police cars painted the scene red and blue, while the crowd buzzed with excitement, shock, and disbelief. People's voices rose and fell like waves, and almost everyone had their phones raised, recording every detail. The story was already traveling far beyond that street, racing across social media in real time. The woman stood tall beside her car, freed from the handcuffs, her wrists still marked by the pressure of the metal. Yet her calm presence made it seem as though she had not been the one restrained but the one in control. Her voice was steady, and her posture strong, while the two officers who had arrested her stood frozen, sweat gathering on their brows. The supervisor, now realizing who she truly was, had gone pale. His mind raced, knowing the consequences that were already unfolding. He wanted to take control of the situation, to calm the storm, but it was far too late. The crowd had seen everything. The truth was out, and nothing could erase the videos already spreading. The woman looked at the officers, her eyes unwavering. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked. Her words were not shouted, yet they carried a weight heavier than anger. They made the officers shrink inside, realizing the power behind her calmness. The younger officer tried to speak. His voice cracked as he said, We didn't know who you were." The woman tilted her head slightly and replied, "It should not matter who I am. The law is not about faces you recognize. It is about fairness. It is about respect." The crowd erupted in cheers at her words. Someone shouted, "That's right." Another voice added, "She's braver than all of them." The energy of the crowd shifted even more strongly to her side, while the two officers looked like men standing on collapsing ground. The supervisor stepped forward cautiously, trying to salvage the moment. "Ma'am, please, let's resolve this quietly," he said. But his attempt only drew louder jeers from the crowd. "Quietly? After all this? Everyone's watching," a man yelled. The supervisor winced, knowing there was no quiet way out anymore. The woman's phone buzzed in her pocket. She reached in calmly and pulled it out. It was a call from the district office. She answered, her voice as composed as ever. "Yes, it has already happened. I'm at the scene now." Her eyes swept over the officers as she spoke. "I will file my report tonight. No, there's no need to send anyone else. The public is already here." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her calmness only deepening the panic on the officers' faces. By now, more police cars had arrived, their sirens cutting through the tension. Higher-ranking officials stepped out, quickly realizing the gravity of the situation. One of them whispered urgently to the supervisor, who only shook his head in silent confirmation. The truth had spread too fast. They were already too late to contain it. The teenager who had first recognized her pushed forward, his phone still recording. His eyes were wide, and his voice shook with both fear and pride. "Ma'am," he said softly, "thank you for standing strong." She gave him a small nod, her expression softening for the first time. "The truth has many witnesses tonight," she said gently, "and you are one of them. Never be afraid to speak it." The boy's heart pounded. The crowd around him clapped and cheered. People began chanting her title, Prosecutor. Prosecutor. Their voices echoing through the street. The chant grew louder, a wave of support washing over her and drowning out the officer's earlier arrogance. The older officer, his pride shattered, finally whispered to his partner, "We're finished." His voice was almost too soft to hear, but the look on his face told the entire story. The younger officer could barely breathe, his hands trembling at his sides. They both knew their careers, their reputations, and perhaps even their freedom were now at risk. The woman did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she stood silently, letting the weight of the moment rest fully on the officer's shoulders. She knew justice was not about revenge. It was about truth, and the truth was already shining brighter than the flashing police lights. A reporter arrived at the scene, having been tipped off by the viral videos spreading online. Microphone in hand, she pushed through the crowd and called out, "Ma'am, is it true? Are you the new federal prosecutor?" The woman turned slightly and answered clearly, "Yes. And tonight, justice was tested in front of all of you." The reporter's camera captured her every word, broadcasting live to thousands of viewers. Across the city, people sat in their living rooms, gasping as they watched the story unfold. In offices, in restaurants, on buses and trains, screens lit up with her face, her calm voice echoing through countless devices. The supervisor finally lowered his head, defeated. "Ma'am," he said, "we'll prepare the full report. These officers will be suspended immediately." But his words sounded weak compared to the truth already spoken by the woman herself. She glanced at him, then back at the crowd. "Do not do it for me," she said. "Do it for the people you swore to protect. Because tonight, they saw who you really are." The crowd roared with applause. Some people shouted her name, others wiped tears from their eyes. It was more than just a traffic stop now. It was a reminder of accountability, of justice, of how truth could not be hidden once it was spoken. The two officers stood in silence, staring at the ground, their hands trembling. Their arrogance had vanished, leaving only fear and regret. They had underestimated a woman they thought was powerless, and now they stood exposed before the world. As the night deepened, the woman stepped back into her car. Before closing the door, she turned once more to the crowd and said, "This is not about me. It is about justice. Remember that the law serves the people, not the other way around." The crowd cheered again, their voices rising into the night sky. She closed the car door, started the engine, and drove away slowly, her headlights cutting through the darkness. Behind her, the officers stood in silence, their world collapsing, while the people chanted the word that would follow them forever: justice. The city did not sleep that night. By the time the woman had driven away, the videos of her encounter with the police had already reached every corner of social media. The news outlets picked it up within hours, their headlines bold and sharp: "Federal prosecutor arrested without cause by local officers." The clips showed her being shoved, handcuffed, and mocked, followed by the powerful moment when she calmly revealed her identity. Millions watched in disbelief as two officers, once proud and confident, froze in shame before the crowd. Back at the police station, silence filled the air. The two officers sat apart from one another, their heads low, their uniforms now feeling heavier than ever. The supervisor walked past them, his face a mixture of anger and fear. He knew that their actions had not only endangered their careers but had also placed the entire department under a glaring spotlight. One of the officers tried to speak, his voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to go like this. We thought she was just..." But his words faded when he realized there was no excuse strong enough to save him. The other officer sat in silence, replaying the night in his mind, remembering how he had laughed when she told them they were making a mistake. That laugh now haunted him. Meanwhile, the woman sat in her quiet apartment. She had poured herself a glass of water and set her files on the table, but she wasn't working. Instead, she replayed the night in her head, not with anger but with a sense of clarity. She knew what needed to be done next. She had not asked for this public moment, but now that it had happened, She had a responsibility to use it for something greater. The next morning, the city woke to a storm of voices. Every major television station and newspaper carried the story. Commentators debated what it meant for law enforcement. Citizens called into radio shows, sharing their thoughts. Some were outraged, others felt hopeful that justice was finally being exposed. In offices, people gathered around screens, shaking their heads at the arrogance of the officers and admiring the composure of the prosecutor. At the federal building downtown, reporters crowded the entrance, waiting for her. When she finally arrived, dressed in the same calm suit but now standing taller than ever, microphones and cameras rushed toward her. "Ma'am, do you plan to press charges?" one reporter asked. Another shouted, "What's your message to the people after last night?" She paused, letting the noise settle. Her voice was steady, every word chosen with care. "What happened last night is not only about me. It is about accountability. The law is meant to protect, not to intimidate. And no officer, no matter their badge, is above the law. We will review everything, and action will be taken. Justice demands nothing less." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras zoomed in closer, and her words quickly echoed across television screens and online platforms. Back at the station, the two officers watched her statement on a small television. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. The older officer whispered, "We're finished. Completely finished." The younger one buried his face in his hands. They both knew suspension was inevitable, but worse than that was the realization that their names had become known across the country, not for honor, but for shame. Later that afternoon, a meeting was called at the federal office. High-ranking officials from the Justice Department gathered around a long table. The atmosphere was tense, but the prosecutor walked in calmly, her presence commanding respect. She placed her hands on the table and addressed the room. "This incident cannot be treated as an isolated mistake. It is a symptom of a larger problem. And as prosecutor, I will ensure that the investigation goes beyond these two men. We must look at the entire system." Her words carried power. The officials nodded gravely, understanding that the nation was now watching. One of them said, "You have the public's support. Use it wisely." That evening, she held another press conference. This time, the crowd outside was even larger. Families, students, workers, and community leaders had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "The law is for the people." The woman stepped onto the podium, the cameras flashing like stars around her. She raised her hands slightly, and silence fell. "Last night, I was handcuffed without reason. I was pushed, mocked, and humiliated. But this is not about me alone. It is about every person who has been silenced, every voice that has been ignored, and every truth that has been hidden. That time is over. The law will not be used as a weapon against the people. It will be restored to what it was meant to be: justice, fairness, and respect." The crowd erupted into cheers. Some people cried, others clapped until their hands hurt. The moment was more than a speech, it was a turning point. The officers who had once believed they held all the power were now symbols of what needed to change. The two men, watching from their homes, felt the weight of her words pierce their hearts. They remembered the smirk, the arrogance, the mockery, and they realized that those moments would follow them forever. The younger one whispered, "We thought she was powerless. We didn't see who she really was." The older officer closed his eyes, whispering back, "No, we didn't see who we really were." The next morning, the headlines were even bolder: "Prosecutor turns injustice into national movement." Editorials praised her courage, commentators analyzed her words, and ordinary people shared their admiration online. Hashtags carrying her name spread like wildfire, uniting voices across the nation. In the federal office, she sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files. She knew the work ahead would not be easy. Reform was not built in a single night. But the spark had been lit, and she was determined to keep it alive. She opened a new file and wrote the first words of her report: "Accountability begins here." The city was buzzing with energy days after the incident. Every cafe, office, and living room carried the same conversation. People replayed the video clips again and again, amazed at the composure of the woman and shocked by the behavior of the officers. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into a story of justice that spread across the country like wildfire. The federal prosecutor, now recognized by almost everyone, remained calm as always. She did not allow the sudden fame to distract her. Instead, she focused on her duty. She knew the real work was only beginning. Words and applause were powerful, but lasting change needed action, structure, and law. She sat at her desk, late at night, the glow of the lamp illuminating stacks of papers. Her pen moved steadily across documents as she prepared official charges. She reviewed every detail of the incident, carefully documenting the behavior of the officers, the failure of their supervisor, and the importance of the witnesses who had spoken up. Her report was not written with anger but with precision. She wanted it to stand as a record that no one could deny. Meanwhile, the two officers lived in silence. Their suspension came quickly, and their names filled the headlines. They avoided going outside, afraid of the whispers, the pointing fingers, and the judgment that followed them everywhere. Once, they had walked with pride in their uniforms. Now, they carried only shame. Neighbors looked at them differently, friends avoided calling, and even family members struggled to understand how arrogance had destroyed everything. In contrast, the community's trust in the prosecutor only grew stronger. Community leaders reached out to her, asking her to speak at events. Students wrote her letters, saying how her bravery inspired them. One child even sent her a hand-drawn picture of her standing tall while two officers looked down in shame. She smiled softly when she received it, placing the drawing carefully on her desk as a reminder of why she worked so hard. The hearing day arrived. The courtroom was filled with people, reporters, and flashing cameras. The two officers sat quietly at the defense table, their faces pale, while the prosecutor entered with calm steps. The judge greeted her respectfully, recognizing the weight of the case. The room fell silent as she began to speak. Her voice was steady, every word carefully chosen. This case is not about power. It is not about who wears a uniform or who holds a title. It is about justice. It is about reminding every officer, every citizen, and every leader that the law is not a weapon of intimidation. It is a shield for protection. And when that shield is abused, it is my duty to act. Gasps and nods filled the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, recording every sentence. The two officers could not lift their heads. They stared at the table, hearing her words pierce deeper than any punishment. She called witnesses one by one. Members of the crowd testified about what they had seen. The teenager who had first recognized her spoke with courage, explaining how he remembered her face from the news. He said, "I thought if I didn't speak, the truth might never come out. But I learned something that night: truth always finds a way." His words moved the entire courtroom. The judge listened carefully, the weight of the case heavy in the air. When the prosecutor finished, silence stretched across the room before the judge finally spoke. His words were firm. "This court acknowledges the misconduct that took place. The officers' actions were unjustified, reckless, and harmful to public trust. They will face disciplinary action, and this court recommends further investigation into systemic issues within the department." The gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder through the courtroom. The officers' fate was sealed. Their careers were over, but more importantly, the entire department was now under review. Outside the courthouse, a sea of people waited. When the prosecutor stepped onto the steps, the crowd erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and chants filled the air. She raised her hands slightly, and the noise softened into expectant silence. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and her words carried with the wind. This victory is not mine. It belongs to every one of you. To every person who has ever felt silenced, ignored, or mistreated. Let this day remind you that justice is alive. That truth cannot be chained. And that no matter how dark the night, the law will stand as long as we stand for it together. The crowd roared with applause, their voices echoing across the city. Some cried tears of relief, others clapped until their hands were sore. The teenager who had spoken in court smiled proudly, feeling part of something greater than himself. Families hugged one another, feeling hopeful for the future. As she stepped down from the podium, a little girl tugged at her sleeve. The child looked up with wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Are you a hero?" The prosecutor knelt down, smiled gently, and replied, "No, sweet one. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who believes in justice. And so can you." The moment touched everyone who witnessed it. The cameras captured the exchange, and by evening, it became the image shown on every screen, the prosecutor kneeling before a child, reminding the world that justice was not about titles or power, but about hope and fairness for all. That night, as the city settled again, the woman returned to her apartment. She placed the child's question in her heart, knowing it would guide her forever. She poured another glass of water, sat by her desk, and looked at the words written in her report, "Accountability begins here." She whispered softly to herself, "And it does not end here." Because she knew this was not the conclusion. This was the beginning of something far larger than one case, one city, or one night. This was the start of a movement that would demand accountability, fairness, and respect everywhere the law reached. And she was ready to lead.